Yielding to their persuasions, Barton left Dublin for England, accompanied by General Montagu. They posted rapidly to London and thence to Dover, whence they took the packet with a fair wind for Calais. The General's confidence in the result of the expedition on Barton's spirits had risen day by day since their departure from the shores of Ireland, for to the inexpressible relief and delight of the latter, he had not since then so much as even once fancied a repetition of those impressions which had, when at home, drawn him gradually down to the very depths of despair. This exemption from what he had begun to regard as the inevitable condition of his existence, and the sense of security which began to pervade his mind, were inexpressively delightful, and in the exultation of what he considered his deliverance, he indulged in 1,000 happy anticipations for a future into which so lately he had hardly dared to look. And, in short, both he and his companion secretly congratulated themselves upon the termination of that persecution which had been to its immediate victim a source of such unspeakable agony. It was a beautiful day, and a crowd of idlers stood upon the jetty to receive the packet and enjoy the bustle of the new arrivals. Montagu walked a few paces in advance of his friend, and as he made his way through the crowd, a little man touched his arm and said to him in a broad provincial patois, "Monsieur is walking too fast. He will lose his sick comrade in the throng, for by my faith, the poor gentleman seems to be fainting." Montagu turned quickly and observed that Barton did indeed look deadly pale. He hastened to his side. "My dear fellow, are you ill?" he asked anxiously. The question was unheeded, and twice repeated, ere Barton stammered, "I saw him. I saw him." "Him? The wretch? Who? Where now? Where is he?" cried Montagu, looking around him. "I saw him, but he is gone," repeated Barton faintly. "But where? Where? For God's sake, speak!" urged Montagu, vehemently. "It is but this moment. Here," said he. "But what did he look like? What had he on? What did he wear? Quick, quick!" urged his excited companion, ready to dart among the crowd and collar the delinquent on the spot. "He touched your arm. He spoke to you." He pointed to me. "God be merciful to me. There is no escape," said Barton in the low, subdued tones of despair. Montagu had already bustled away in all the flurry of mingled hope and rage. But though the singular personnel of the stranger who had accosted him was vividly impressed upon his recollection, he failed to discover among the crowd even the slightest resemblance to him. After a fruitless search, in which he enlisted the services of several of the bystanders, who aided all the more zealously as they believed he had been robbed, he at length, out of breath and baffled, gave over the attempt. "Ah, my friend, it won't do," said Barton, with a faint voice and bewildered, ghastly look of one who had been stunned by some mortal shock. "There is no use in contending. Whatever it is, the dreadful association between me and it is now established. I shall never escape. Never." "Nonsense, nonsense, my dear Barton. Don't talk so," said Montagu, with something at once of irritation and dismay. "You must not, I say. We'll jockey the scoundrel yet. Never mind, I say. Never mind." It was, however, but labour lost to endeavour henceforward to inspire Barton with one ray of hope. He became desponding. This intangible, and as it seemed utterly inadequate influence, was fast destroying his energies of intellect, character and health. His first object was now to return to Ireland, there, as he believed, and now almost hoped, speedily to die. To Ireland accordingly he came, and one of the first faces he saw upon the shore was again that of his implacable and dreaded attendant. Barton seemed at last to have lost not only all enjoyment and every hope in existence, but all independence of will besides. He now submitted himself passively to the management of the friends most nearly interested in his welfare. With the apathy of entire despair, he implicitly assented to whatever measures they suggested and advised. and as a last resource, it was determined to remove him to a house of Lady Rochdale's in the neighbourhood of Clontarf, where, with the advice of his medical attendant, who persisted in his opinion that the whole train of consequences resulted merely from some nervous derangement, it was resolved that he was to confine himself strictly to the house and make use only of those apartments which commanded a view of an enclosed yard, the gates of which were to be kept jealously locked. Those precautions would certainly secure him against the casual appearance of any living form that his excited imagination might possibly confound with the spectre which, as it was contended, his fancy recognised in every figure that bore even a distant or general resemblance to the peculiarities with which his fancy had at first invested it. A month or 6 weeks' absolute seclusion under those conditions, it was hoped might, by interrupting the series of these terrible impressions, gradually dispel the predisposing apprehensions and the associations which had confirmed the supposed disease and rendered recovery hopeless. Cheerful society and that of his friends was to be constantly supplied, and on the whole, very sanguine expectations were indulged in that under the treatment thus detailed. The obstinate hypochondria of the patient might at length give way. Accompanied therefore by Lady Rochdale, General Montagu and his daughter, his own affianced bride, poor Barton, himself never daring to cherish a hope of his ultimate emancipation from the horrors under which his life was literally wasting away, took possession of the apartments whose situation protected him against the intrusions from which he shrank with such unutterable terror. After a little time, a steady persistence in this system began to manifest its results in a very marked though gradual improvement alike in the health and spirits of the invalid. Not indeed that anything at all approaching complete recovery was yet discernible. On the contrary, to those who had not seen him since the commencement of his strange sufferings, such an alteration would have been apparent as might well have shocked them. The improvement, however, such as it was welcomed with gratitude and delight, especially by the young lady, whom her attachment to him, as well as her now singularly painful position consequent on his protracted illness, rendered an object scarcely 1 degree less to be commiserated than himself. A week passed, a fortnight, a month, and yet there had been no recurrence of the hated visitation. The treatment had, so far forth, been followed by complete success. The chain of associations was broken, the constant pressure upon the overtasked spirits had been removed, and, under these comparatively favourable circumstances, the sense of social community with the world about him, and something of human interest, if not of enjoyment, began to reanimate him. It was about this time that Lady Rochdale, who, like most old ladies of the day, was deep in family receipts, and a great pretender to medical science, dispatched her own maid to the kitchen garden with a list of herbs which were there to be carefully culled and brought back to her housekeeper for the purpose stated. The handmaiden, however, returned with her task scarce half completed and a good deal flurried and alarmed. Her mode of accounting for her precipitate retreat and evident agitation was odd, and to the old lady, startling. It appeared that she had repaired to the kitchen garden pursuant to her mistress's directions, and had there begun to make the specified election among the rank and neglected herbs which crowded one corner of the enclosure, and while engaged in this pleasant labour, she carelessly sang a fragment of an old song, as she said, to keep herself company. She was, however, interrupted by a sort of mocking echo of the air she was singing, and, looking up, she saw through the old thorn hedge which surrounded the garden a singularly ill-looking little man, whose countenance wore the stamp of menace and malignity, standing close to her at the other side of the hawthorn screen. She described herself as utterly unable to move or speak, while he charged her with a message for Captain Barton, the substance of which she distinctly remembered to have been to the effect that he, Captain Barton, must come abroad as usual and show himself to his friends out of doors, or else prepare for a visit in his own chamber. On concluding this brief message, The stranger had, with a threatening air, got down into the outer ditch and, seizing the hawthorn stems in his hands, seemed on the point of climbing through the fence, a feat which might have been accomplished without much difficulty. Without, of course, awaiting this result, the girl, throwing down her treasures of thyme and rosemary, had turned and run with the swiftness of terror to the house. Lady Rochdale commanded her on pain of instant dismissal to observe an absolute silence respecting all that passed of the incident which related to Captain Barton, and, at the same time, directed instant search to be made by her men in the garden and the fields adjacent. This measure, however, was as usual unsuccessful and filled with undefinable misgivings. Lady Rochdale communicated the incident to her brother. The story, however, until long afterwards, went no further, and, of course, it was jealously guarded from Barton, who continued to mend, though slowly. Barton now began to walk occasionally in the courtyard, which I have mentioned, and which, being enclosed by a high wall, commanded no view beyond its own extent. Here he, therefore, considered himself perfectly secure, and, but for a careless violation of orders by one of the grooms, he might have enjoyed, at least for some time longer, his much prized immunity. Opening upon the public road, this yard was entered by a wooden gate with a wicket in it, and was further defended by an iron gate upon the outside. Strict orders had been given to keep both carefully locked, but spite of these, it had happened that one day, as Barton was slowly pacing this narrow enclosure in his accustomed walk, and reaching the farther extremity, was turning to retrace his steps, he saw the boarded wicket ajar, and the face of his tormentor immovably looking at him through the iron bars. For a few seconds, he stood, riveted to the earth, breathless and bloodless, in the fascination of that dreaded gaze, and then fell helplessly insensible upon the pavement. There he was found a few minutes afterwards and conveyed to his room, the apartment which he was never afterwards to leave alive. Henceforward, a marked and unaccountable change was observable in the tone of his mind. Captain Barton was now no longer the excited and despairing man he had been before. A strange alteration had passed upon him. An unearthly tranquillity reigned in his mind. It was the anticipated stillness of the grave. "Montague, my friend, this struggle is nearly ended now," he said tranquilly, but with a look of fixed and fearful awe. "I have at last some comfort from that world of spirits from which my punishment has come. I now know that my sufferings will soon be over." Montague pressed him to speak on. "Yes," said he in a softened voice, "my punishment is nearly ended. From sorrow, perhaps, I shall never in time or eternity escape, but my agony is almost over. Comfort has been revealed to me, and what remains of my allotted struggle I will bear with submission, even with hope." "I am glad to hear you speak so tranquilly, my dear Barton," said Montague. "Peace and cheer of mind are all you need to make you what you were." No, I never can be that," said he mournfully. "I am no longer fit for life. I am soon to die. I am to see him but once again, and then all is ended." "He said so then?" suggested Montague. "He? No. Good tidings could scarcely come through him, and these were good and welcome, and they came so solemnly and sweetly, with unutterable love and melancholy, such as I could not, without saying more than is needful or fitting, of any other long past scenes and persons, fully explain to you." As Barton said this, he shed tears. Come, said Montague, mistaking the source of his emotions. "You must not give way. What is it, after all, but a pack of dreams and nonsense, or at worst, the practices of a scheming rascal that enjoys his power of playing upon your nerves and loves to exert it. A sneaking vagabond that owes you a grudge and pays it off this way, not daring to try a more manly one. A grudge indeed he owes me, you say rightly, said Barton with a sudden shudder. A grudge, as you call it. Oh my God! When the justice of heaven permits the evil one to carry out a scheme of vengeance, when its execution is committed to the lost and terrible victim of sin, who owes his own ruin to the very man whom he is commissioned to pursue, then indeed the torments and terrors of hell are anticipated on earth. But heaven has dealt mercifully with me. Hope has opened to me at last, and if death could come without the dreadful sight I am doomed to see, I would gladly close my eyes this moment upon the world. But though death is welcome, I shrink with an agony you cannot understand, an actual frenzy of terror, from the last encounter with that demon who has drawn me thus to the verge of the chasm, and who is himself to plunge me down. I am to see him again, once more, but under circumstances unutterably more terrific than ever. As Barton thus spoke, he trembled so violently that Montague was really alarmed at the extremity of his sudden agitation, and hastened to lead him back to the topic which had before seemed to exert so tranquilizing an effect on his mind. "It was not a dream," he said after a time. "I was in a different state. I felt differently and strangely, and yet it was all as real, as clear and vivid as what I now see and hear. It was a reality." "And what did you see and hear?" urged his companion. "When I wakened from the swoon I fell into on seeing him," said Barton, continuing as if he had not heard the question, "it was slowly, very slowly. I was lying by the margin of a broad lake with misty hills all round, and a soft, melancholy, rose-coloured light illuminated it all. It was unusually sad and lonely, and yet more beautiful than any earthly scene. My head was leaning on the lap of a girl, and she was singing a song that told, I know not how, whether by words or harmonies, of all my life, all that is past and all that is still to come. And with the song, the old feelings that I thought had perished within me came back, and tears flowed from my eyes, partly for the song and its mysterious beauty, and partly for the unearthly sweetness of her voice. And yet I knew the voice, oh how well, and I was spellbound as I listened and looked at the solitary scene, without stirring, almost without breathing, and alas, alas, without turning my eyes to the face that I knew was near me. So sweetly powerful was the enchantment that held me, and so slowly the song and scene grew fainter and fainter to my senses, till all was dark and still again. And then I awoke to this world, as you saw, comforted, for I knew that I was forgiven much." Barton wept again, long and bitterly. From this time, as we have said, the prevailing tone of his mind was one of profound and tranquil melancholy. This, however, was not without its interruptions. He was thoroughly impressed with the conviction that he was to experience another and final visitation, transcending in horror all he had before experienced from this anticipated and unknown agony. He often shrank in such paroxysms of abject terror and distraction as filled the whole household with dismay and superstitious panic. Even those among them who affected to discredit the theory of preternatural agency were often in their secret souls visited during the silence of the night with qualms and apprehensions which they would not have readily confessed, and none of them attempted to dissuade Barton from the resolution on which he now systematically acted of shutting himself up in his own apartment. The window blinds of this room were kept jealously down, and his own man was seldom out of his presence, day or night, his bed being placed in the same chamber. This man was an attached and respectable servant, and his duties, in addition to those ordinarily imposed upon valets, but which Barton's independent habits generally dispensed with, were to attend carefully to the simple precautions by means of which his master hoped to exclude the dreaded inclusion of the Watcher, and in addition to attending to those arrangements which amounted merely to guarding against the possibility of his master's being, through any unscreened window or open door, exposed to the dreaded influence, the valet was never to suffer him to be alone. Total solitude, even for a minute, had become to him now almost as intolerable as the idea of going abroad into the public ways. It was an instinctive anticipation of what was coming. It is needless to say that under these circumstances, no steps were taken towards the fulfilment of that engagement into which he had entered. There was quite disparity enough in point of years, and indeed of habits, between the young lady and Captain Barton to have precluded anything like very vehement or romantic attachment on her part. Though grieved and anxious, therefore, she was very far from being heartbroken. Miss Montague, however, devoted much of her time to the patient but fruitless attempt to cheer the unhappy invalid. She read for him and conversed with him, but it was apparent that whatever exertions he made, the endeavour to escape from the one ever-waking fear that preyed upon him was utterly and miserably unavailing. Young ladies are much given to the cultivation of pets, and among those who shared the favour of Miss Montague was a fine old owl which the gardener who caught him napping among the ivy of a ruined stable had dutifully presented to that young lady. The caprice which regulates such preferences was manifested in the extravagant favour with which this grim and ill-favoured bird was at once distinguished by his mistress, and, trifling as this whimsical circumstance may seem, I am forced to mention it inasmuch as it is connected, oddly enough, with the concluding scene of the story. Barton, so far from sharing in this liking for the new favourite, regarded it from the very first with an antipathy as violent as it was utterly unaccountable. Its very vicinity was unsupportable to him. He seemed to hate and dread it with a vehemence absolutely laughable, and which, to those who have never witnessed the exhibition of antipathies of this kind, would seem all but incredible. With these few words of preliminary explanation, I shall proceed to state the particulars of the last scene in this strange series of incidents. It was almost 2 o'clock one winter's night, and Barton was, as usual at that hour, in his bed. The servant we have mentioned occupied a smaller bed in the same room, and a light was burning. The man was on a sudden aroused by his master, who said, "I can't get it out of my head that accursed bird has got out somehow and is lurking in some corner of the room. I have been dreaming about him. Get up, Smith, and look about. Search for him. Such hateful dreams." The servant rose and examined the chamber, and while engaged in doing so, he heard the well-known sound, more like a long-drawn gasp than a hiss, with which these birds from their secret haunts affright the quiet of the night. This ghostly indication of its proximity, for the sound proceeded from the passage upon which Barton's chamber door opened, determined the search of the servant, who, opening the door, proceeded a step or two forward for the purpose of driving the bird away. He had, however, hardly entered the lobby when the door behind him slowly swung to under the impulse, as it seemed, of some gentle current of air. But as immediately over the door there was a kind of window intended in the daytime to aid in lighting the passage, and through which at present the rays of the candle were issuing, the valet could see quite enough for his purpose. As he advanced, he heard his master, who, lying in a well-curtained bed, had not, as it seemed, perceived his exit from the room, call him by name and direct him to place the candle on the table by his bed. The servant, who was now some way in the long passage, and not liking to raise his voice for the purpose of replying, lest he should startle the sleeping inmates of the house, began to walk hurriedly and softly back again, when to his amazement he heard a voice in the interior of the chamber answering calmly, and actually saw, through the window which overtopped the door, that the light was slowly shifting, as if carried across the room in answer to his master's call. Palsied by a feeling akin to terror, yet not unmingled with curiosity, he stood breathless and listened at the threshold, unable to summon resolution to push open the door and enter. Then came a rustling of the curtains, and a sound like that of one who in a low voice hushes a child to rest, in the midst of which he heard Barton say in a tone of stifled horror, "Oh God! Oh my God!" and repeat the same exclamation several times. Then ensued a silence which again was broken by the strange soothing sound, and at last there burst forth in one swelling peal a yell of agony so appalling and hideous that under some impulse of an ungovernable horror the man rushed to the door and with his whole strength strove to force it open. Whether it was that in his agitation he had himself but imperfectly turned the handle, or that the door was really secured upon the inside, he failed to effect an entrance, and as he tugged and pushed, yell after yell rang louder and wilder through the chamber, accompanied all the while by the same hushed sounds. Actually freezing with terror, and scarce knowing what he did, the man turned and ran down the passage, wringing his hands in the extremity of horror and irresolution. At the stairhead, he was encountered by General Montague, scared and eager, and just as they met, the fearful sounds had ceased. "What is it? Who? Where is your master?" said Montague with the incoherence of extreme agitation. "Has anything... For God's sake, is anything wrong?" "Lord have mercy on us. It's all over," said the man, staring wildly towards his master's chamber. "He's dead, sir. I'm sure he's dead." Without waiting for inquiry or explanation, Montague, closely followed by the servant, hurried to the chamber door, turned the handle and pushed it open. As the door yielded to his pressure, the ill-omened bird of which the servant had been in search, uttering its spectral warning, started suddenly from the far side of the bed, and flying through the doorway close over their heads, and extinguishing in his passage the candle which Montague carried, crashed through the skylight that overlooked the lobby and sailed away into the darkness of the outer space. "There it is, God bless us," whispered the man after a breathless pause. "Curse that bird," muttered the general, startled by the suddenness of the apparition and unable to conceal his discomposure. "The candle is moved," said the man after another breathless pause, pointing to the candle that still burned in the room. "See? They put it by the bed." "Draw the curtains, fellow, and don't stand gaping there," whispered Montague sternly. The man hesitated. "Hold this, then," said Montague, impatiently thrusting the candlestick into the servant's hand, and himself advancing to the bedside. He drew the curtains apart. The light of the candle, which was still burning at the bedside, fell upon the figure huddled together and half upright at the head of the bed. It seemed as though it had slunk back as far as the solid panelling would allow, and the hands were still clutched in the bedclothes. "Barton! Barton! Barton!" cried the general, with a strange mixture of awe and vehemence. He took the candle and held it so that it shone full upon the face. The features were fixed, stern and white. The jaw was fallen, and the sightless eyes, still open, gazed vacantly forward towards the front of the bed. "God Almighty! He's dead," muttered the general as he looked upon this fearful spectacle. They both continued to gaze upon it in silence for a minute or more. "And cold too," whispered Montague, withdrawing his hand from that of the dead man. "And see, may I never have life, sir," added the man after another pause with a shudder. "But there was something else on the bed with him. Look there! Look there! See that, sir?" As the man thus spoke, he pointed to a deep indenture as if caused by a heavy pressure near the foot of the bed. Montague was silent. "Come, sir, come away for God's sake," whispered the man, drawing close up to him and holding fast by his arm while he glanced fearfully round. "What good can be done here now? Come away for God's sake." At this moment they heard the steps of more than one approaching, and Montague, hastily desiring the servant to arrest their progress, endeavoured to lose the rigid grip with which the fingers of the dead man were clutched in the bedclothes, and drew as well as he was able the awful figure into a reclining posture. Then, closing the curtains carefully upon it, he hastened himself to meet those persons that were approaching. It is needless to follow the personages so slightly connected with this narrative into the events of their afterlife. It is enough to say that no clue to the solution of these mysterious occurrences was ever after discovered. And so long an interval having now passed since the event which I have just described concluded this strange history, it is scarcely to be expected that time can throw any new lights upon its dark and inexplicable outline. Until the secrets of the earth shall be no longer hidden, therefore these transactions must remain shrouded in their original obscurity. The only occurrence in Captain Barton's former life to which reference was ever made as having any possible connection with the sufferings with which his existence closed, and which he himself seemed to regard as working out a retribution for some grievous sin of his past life, was a circumstance which not for several years after his death was brought to light. The nature of this disclosure was painful to his relatives and discreditable to his memory. It appeared that 6 years before Captain Barton's final return to Dublin, he had formed in the town of Plymouth a guilty attachment, the object of which was the daughter of one of the ship's crew under his command. The father had visited the frailty of his unhappy child with extreme harshness and even brutality, and it was said that she had died heartbroken. Presuming upon Barton's implication in her guilt, this man had conducted himself towards Barton with marked insolence. Barton retaliated, and what he resented with still more exasperated bitterness was the father's treatment of the unfortunate girl. Barton's punishment, a systematic exercise of those terrible and arbitrary severities which the regulations of the Navy placed at the command of those who are responsible for its discipline. The man had at length made his escape while the vessel was in port at Naples, but died, as it was said, in a hospital in that town of the wounds inflicted in one of his recent and sanguinary punishments. Whether these circumstances in reality bear or not upon the occurrences of Barton's afterlife, it is of course impossible to say. It seems, however, more than probable that they were, at least in his own mind, closely associated with them. But however the truth may be as to the origin and motives of this mysterious persecution, there can be no doubt that, with respect to the agencies by which it was accomplished, absolute and impenetrable mystery is like to prevail until the day of doom.